Did you struggle to feel like yourself after becoming a parent? Did you find yourself without the support necessary to fully heal, which made feeding human milk to your baby that much more difficult? So many of us experience what we thought would be a joyous time in silos, feeling disillusioned that parenting didn't match our expectations. My guest Megan shares about how breastfeeding her first baby in isolation made getting her own needs met so much harder, which is why she worked so hard to put more robust supports in place for her second postpartum experience. As you're listening, please go into your podcasting app and give a 5-star rating and review the show. It will go a long way in helping me to connect with people to share their stories on the show. And then once you've heard this story of Megan getting the support she needed in the postpartum period, if you know someone who could benefit from hearing the story themselves, please share it. Enjoy. When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore breastfeeding experiences through the lens of systemic barriers, so that you know your breastfeeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are.
I'm Megan Peasley. I am a doula, birth photographer, and childbirth educator. And I live in Acton, Massachusetts with my 2 kids and dog and 2 rabbits and husband.
Have to call out the animals.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. I would love to know, before it was your turn and you were doing it yourself, what your exposure was to feeding babies from a body.
Yeah. So I was on the younger side for my friend group. I was really the first of my friend group to have a baby. I was 26 when I had my son. And I hadn't really known anyone personally that I'd seen breastfeeding much. I suppose I'd seen my aunts breastfeeding because all of my cousins are younger. I'm the oldest on both sides. And my mom breastfed both me and my sister. So it was always something that I just assumed I would do, but I didn't necessarily have a strong understanding of the mechanics of it or how hard it was. It was just something that was always I'll do that when I have kids. But yeah, not a lot of direct. Didn't have a friend that I knew that had gone through the process before. I was too young when my mom had my sister to watch her go through it. So yeah, definitely not a lot of one-on-one experience with it.
Yeah, when you say you saw your aunts feeding your cousins, how old were you when you were seeing that?
I was actually a teenager. Yeah, my first cousin that was born, he was born when I was 13. Yeah, so I did get to see them breastfeeding with all of their kids, but only occasionally. We just would see each other at family gatherings and they'd go off in the other room to breastfeed. And I knew it was happening, but I wasn't right there with them.
Okay, yeah, that was my next question. How open were they when they were feeding their babies? Was it they felt like they could feed anywhere, anytime, or was it more, I'm going to go off into another room?
I think it was mostly, I'm going to go off into another room, which was big family functions. So it could have also been just for a little quiet. I don't know.
Yeah. And then did you ever have any conversations either before you had your kids or after with family members about the history of baby feeding in your family once you became curious about birth work?
Yeah, definitely. I'm lucky enough actually that one of my aunts is an IBCLC.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was a huge part of both of my breastfeeding stories and my success with it, because I did run into issues, different types of issues with both kids. And she was the first person that I reached out to when I was encountering those things. And we didn't live close by. The first time I was in Southern California and she was in Northern California. So it was more remote, just asking questions and getting support kind of thing. But even that was really helpful and just gave me a lot of encouragement.
Amazing. And who initiated that? Because I know as an IBCLC myself, when you have family members who are having babies, it's really hard to figure out that boundary of, hey, I'm happy to help you, and also giving people the space to figure out their own journeys.
Yeah.
So, was it you knowing that she was a lactation consultant and reaching out to her, or was it her saying, hey, I'm here for you if you need? Do you remember?
Yeah, it was I'm trying to remember with my first I think it was a little bit of both. Like she brought up that or it might even have been my mom that brought it up that
Mm.
remember your aunt's a lactation consultant. It was kind of like you have this resource available. I definitely knew about it. Then when I was actually going through it, I actually directly reached out to her, I think both times when it was at a point where I felt like I needed some support.
You were 26 when you had your first,
Mhm.
and so many people do a lot of preparation for birth. And then you hear people that say, oh, I just, went in blind. So, where did you fall on that spectrum of preparation for both birth and baby feeding?
Yeah, I thought I was prepared is
Mm.
the spot where I would fall. I now as a doula, I know there was a lot more I could have done, especially with what my ideal birth plan was in my head. I took a hospital birth class. It was I think a 3-class series if I remember correctly. And it did the basic job of informing you about like your pain management options and things like that, but it didn't go super in depth into if you want an unmedicated birth, which is what I wanted, here are all your alternative options. And maybe you should get a doula and maybe you should consider, focusing not only on birth positions, but also some mental coping strategies. And here's how you're going to need to advocate to have an unmedicated birth. When I actually went into labor, it was very much like being hit by everything all at once. And I didn't have slow, gentle, I'm having early contractions and I have time to wrap my head around this and I might be in labor. I went straight into basically active labor. In looking back, I think I had some prodromal labor going on for a few days before that. There was definitely things happening, but when I actually went into labor, it was pretty abrupt. And so I ended up getting an epidural, which I hadn't planned on. And the birth itself, it was a very textbook smooth birth on paper, but I came out of it feeling like what just happened to me. And it took me a long time to process it. And it was definitely not the birth that I was expecting to have. And my prep for breastfeeding was even less. I did a little bit of poking around online. Somebody, I don't remember who it was, that had given me the tip of at least look at what a good latch versus a bad latch looks like. For some videos. It might have been something that came up in that childbirth ed class that I took. And so I did do that. I like just looked into some online resources and tried to hobble together, okay, I think this is what I'm going to need to do. And I think this is what I should expect. I had a basic understanding, but I didn't take like a breastfeeding prep class or anything like that.
So you said the birth was not what you had hoped for or expected. Knowing that this is a breastfeeding centered podcast and not a birth centered podcast, tell us what happened in the birth that may have positively or negatively impacted your breastfeeding experience, knowing
Yeah.
what you
So
know now.
definitely one of the biggest things that was hard about breastfeeding my son, which he was my firstborn, was that he was a very sleepy newborn. He was the type that you have to be doing all the things to try to wake him up for that first day or two to get him to feed. And so he lost a lot of weight, which then led to the suggestion of you should supplement with formula, and caused a lot of stress and a lot of back and forth doctor's appointments that led to a really slow recovery for me because I was constantly going to pediatrician appointments. So I didn't have any pain meds. The only pain medication that I ended up getting was an epidural. But from what I know now, sometimes especially because I would say that my epidural, I didn't have an epidural for long before he was born. It was only a couple of hours. I think maybe the initial like loading dose of that epidural and how heavy it was in the beginning, I just look back at it and I wonder if I had a little bit of an effect on him from that. And then also just the stress that both of us went through during pushing. That was the hardest part of my birth experience. Everything was very smooth up until I started pushing, and I pushed for a little over 2 hours, which is not uncommon in a first-time mom with an epidural. But he had a lot of stressful moments where his heart rate was not loving what I was doing with the forced pushing that they were encouraging me to do. Pushed the whole time on my back. The same like classic epidural story of not being encouraged to move into different positions, doing purple pushing. And there were moments where they had me on oxygen because they were worried about him. And so I wonder if the stress of that also just led to a sleepier baby, because it was a little bit of a harder experience on both of us. Yeah. So those are the things I wonder about in my first birth. Of course, the research on it is mixed as to whether or not epidural affects breastfeeding. But I'm a research nerd. Like, my background is as a biologist. So of course I dug into all of this after his birth, because of course there was a lot of questions that I had about how things went.
Yeah, of course. And we can never know exactly how things would be different given
Yep.
a different situation. Of course, we always replay the scenarios in our minds and wonder, but we just don't know. Were you on IV fluids with the
Yes.
epidural? Yeah.
Yep. That too. Yeah. And I have something that we haven't really touched on yet, is that I have type 1 diabetes. Yeah. And so the other stressful part of my birth experience, although I don't think it really affected the breastfeeding part, is just arguing with my doctors about insulin dosing and things that I normally am very much in control of, and them wanting to have control over what I was doing and having to advocate around that. So that was the other stressful element of that birth, was just dealing with all of the diabetes management and pressure around that. Like any parent, we'll walk through fire for our kids. So we end up with the best blood sugars that we've ever had in our lives, like to a point where our overall averages are like within the normal range. There's blood tests that they do to look at the statistical average over a 3-month period. And if you compared like during my pregnancies, that to what people without diabetes have, mine was very similar.
Okay, so they're not worried about the blood sugars of the baby more so because you have type 1 diabetes.
They're worried in the first couple of days.
Okay.
There's definitely, just like with gestational diabetes, they
Mhm.
do blood sugars on the baby for the first 24 hours at least.
Mhm.
And just to make sure that they're not too low, because a baby that is during pregnancy, a baby is having to cope with the parent's blood sugars, the gestational parent's blood sugars. If my blood sugars were running high, that would mean that my babies were making more insulin to cope with that. And so when they come
Mhm.
out after birth, they're used to making more insulin, and they're not used to
Right.
being in a lower glycemic environment. And so they can have more low blood sugars in the first couple of days.
Okay.
And that's especially complicated if they have other risk factors for low blood sugars, like if they're born early, like at
Okay.
37 or 38 weeks, which sometimes happens because people with diabetes are at higher risk for things like preeclampsia and sometimes
Okay.
need to be induced on the earlier side.
Even though you had always had your blood sugars really well controlled, did you use a pump?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been using a pump since I was 13.
Okay. So you've been using a pump to control your blood sugars from the time for 13 years at that point by the time you were 26,
Yep.
and you can continue to use a pump throughout pregnancy. You were still getting a lot of pushback from your providers. Were you required to be induced at 39 weeks?
That was the recommendation. I pushed back very hard against that. Again, because of my family's experience with big babies, that threat did not worry me. And
Mm.
I'm a very stubborn person who also was at the time a scientist. And so I dug into the research and I went, this doesn't really hold up, this recommendation of a 39-week induction. So I'm going to push back as much as I can on that. And my induction with My son was scheduled for, I think, 39 and 5 or 39 and 6, but I went into labor at 39 weeks and 2 days. So I managed to avoid it because I had pushed back even just a few extra days.
Are you pregnant or a new parent looking to ensure a better postpartum experience? Or are you a birth worker looking to improve your postpartum care skills? Check out Thriving After Birth, an online self-paced course by me, midwife and educator Tanya Tringali. It's 10 and a half hours of video content featuring experts in lactation, mental health, pelvic floor health, pediatric sleep issues. You also get worksheets and a workbook, as well as options to have a one-on-one session with me. Sign up at motherwitmaternity.com/thriving, and let's improve postpartum care together.
Okay, so then did you receive any pressure to formula feed as they were monitoring blood sugars of the baby once you delivered?
So both of my kids luckily didn't have blood sugar issues. So I didn't have to navigate it based on that. I have seen clients deal with that. And what is some just a little tip that I like to put out there that you probably know for any listeners that I always recommend now is, as an alternative to that, having colostrum ready to go. For
Mhm.
the typical person going into labor, whether or not having a store of colostrum is helpful is debatable. But I think with somebody with diabetes whose kids are going to be watched really carefully in the first couple of days for blood sugar issues, having a few syringes with colostrum ready to go can be like a nice option for avoiding the formula push. But yeah, I was lucky enough to get to avoid that element of formula being pushed anyway.
Okay, but you had this sleepy baby with your first,
Yes.
so that's where that came in.
Yeah. No, like I said, he was really difficult to wake up. I feel like this is pretty common. I didn't realize just how much of a job feeding a baby in those first days and weeks is. That it's not, they say a newborn needs to feed every 3 hours, right? And so you think that's okay, 8 times a day, I'll be feeding a baby. I can make that work. But really, what that looked like for me was spending half an hour trying to wake him up enough to latch on, being a little bit uncertain of whether or not his latch was even good. Was he getting enough colostrum? And how soon is my milk going to come in? All of those questions, navigating those in the first few days were just something I was not prepared for. And then, like I mentioned, by the time that we were discharged from the hospital, he had lost about 10% of his birth weight. And that's when they started saying, okay, you're going to need to come back to the pediatrician right away for a weight check. And if he has lost more weight or hasn't started leveling off or going back up in his weight, then we'd recommend topping off with formula. And there was never any recommendation of like, and see an IBCLC or talk to a lactation consultant. It was just like, if this isn't going well, we're going to need to introduce formula. Yeah.
Which is, I always think the term topping off is very strange because when you top off a cup of coffee at a diner, you can see,
Mm-hmm.
how much you're supposed to top off.
Yeah.
You cannot see how much you're supposed to top off in a baby.
Yeah.
And they could be crying because they're a baby new to the world. They
Mm-hmm.
could be crying because they don't like the feel of their diaper. They could be
Yeah.
crying because they've had too much milk in their belly. There's a lot of reasons why babies cry. And there's a lot of uncertainty when parents are now isolated in their homes and we do this parenting thing all by ourselves with very
Mm-hmm.
little exposure to babies before
Yeah.
it's our turn.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I had very little exposure to babies before it was my turn. I had never been much of a kid person, to be honest. Like, I
Mhm.
had babysat a couple of times and things like that, but just, yeah, this was definitely my first experience with a newborn. And yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned having a sleepy baby, and you mentioned you got some lactation help at the hospital.
Mhm.
So what was the advice you got in helping you with the sleepy baby from lactation, and was any of it helpful?
So I only remember, and I did advocate to get out of the hospital somewhat on the quicker side because they were driving me crazy with wanting to check my blood sugar constantly. And so I only remember a lactation consultant coming by once in like the first 24 hours or so. And it was like the day after I gave birth because I gave birth to him in the afternoon. It was, I think, around 1:30 or so in the afternoon. And I don't think anybody came by that day, which is a bit odd because it was a weekday. And this is a major hospital in Los Angeles. And the next day, I'm pretty sure was the first time that I saw a lactation consultant. And they came in and they were like, yeah, looks like you have a good latch. Looks like things are going well. And that was about it. I don't remember there being anything about here's some tips. I do remember that was by the time I got home, I knew that there was this issue of him not waking up enough. And I knew that there was pressure to get him to eat. And that's really when I started looking into tips for keeping him awake. And I reached out to my aunt who was helpful with trying to give some tips of make sure you're doing skin to skin to try to wake him up. And both of you need to be talking to him and tickling him and things like that. And yes, you should be waking him up to feed. And she tried her best to help from afar. But it was just still, it was like that little bit of help remotely. And then on the other side of things, a very nice and well-meaning pediatrician who was not really helping us on the breastfeeding side at all. Just very much focused on like, he's still losing weight. We recommend adding formula. And so I think it was the second or third day. It was like by the time that we were getting to the evening of the second day we were home, we were topping off with formula a couple of times. And he spit most of it back up. It wasn't really, I don't know if he actually got any of it down, but I was super upset about it. My husband was doing his best to help me with navigating all of this and being super supportive. And he was like, this doesn't seem like it's the formula doesn't seem like something he wants. It doesn't seem like it's working. Let's just keep trying to stick with breastfeeding. So there was a lot in the first, I would say, especially week of his life of just us constantly around the clock trying to keep him awake enough to feed. And I was lucky that he did have a good latch and that I didn't get a lot of damage. I was uncomfortable. I think back to just the fact that I was constantly, and he was on for long periods of time. There was not like a big break in between feeds since it took him so long to eat that I think contributed to, but I didn't get to a point where my nipples were badly damaged or anything like that. It was just more a feeling of exhaustion from constantly trying to keep him awake enough to nurse.
Yeah. And do you have any ideas about why he was so sleepy?
Yeah. And also from what I see now, quite often, like sometimes newborns are just for the first few days a little bit on the sleepier side. And he ever since has, so my milk came in like around the typical 3-day mark and things started getting better from there. And so now I look back at all of this and I go, there was nothing wrong. He was just a typical newborn who was a little bit on the sleepier side, but he was probably getting plenty of colostrum. It's normal for babies to lose weight in those first couple of days. And I was just being pushed for a problem that probably wasn't really there. We were probably doing just fine. And I think I still would have needed to be nursing him frequently and waking him up to get my milk to come in. But I don't think there needed to be such an emphasis on his weight loss. And yeah, I think
So probably you just needed to be told, yeah, your baby's sleepy,
Mhm.
bring them to the breast frequently, do a lot of just nursing in, sit on the couch with him, skin to skin. Don't go longer than 2 to 3 hours without
Mhm.
feeding him. Let's check him frequently. You're doing a great job.
Exactly. Just that reassurance that this happens and
Mhm.
that I'm not the only one. It felt like like I said, I'd never known anybody that had gone through this before. And
Mhm.
so I didn't know that what I was experiencing with having to nurse around the clock and dealing with having to struggle a little bit to get him to be awake enough to nurse, I didn't know all of that could be normal. Yeah. And the other part of this whole picture with his birth and that postpartum was that we did have my mom stay for a few days, and we definitely had some family support, but they didn't live close by. And with all of so my pediatrician's office was at that same hospital, which is also where I worked at the time. And it was 40 minutes from our house and in LA traffic. And so I was a 2 days postpartum mom sitting in the car for 40 minutes each way, going to pediatrician appointments the first few days. I wasn't taking care of myself. And that first entire year of his life, I feel like was set in motion by that postpartum time. I ended up with an infection in the area that had been stitched up.
Oh no.
Which was not taken seriously initially by my providers. I had to call multiple times to finally get seen because there's that gap of you go home from the hospital. I remember them checking my stitches once in the hospital, and it was like they just lift the cover, shine a little flashlight, everything looks fine. No great information going home about how to take care of any of that besides here's a peri bottle. And no one said to me throughout the entire process, you need to be resting and taking care of yourself for the first few weeks. So I did the typical, I'm going to be up and I'm going to go on walks and I'm going to do all the things, and ended up with an infection, ended up on antibiotics for that a few weeks later after having just incredible pain. And like I said, it took several phone calls to even get in with someone to get seen for that, even though I was at that point, I think I was about 3 weeks out, and I was still having excruciating pain. And then after all of that, ended up needing a lot of pelvic floor physical therapy to just get back to normal because I had some scar tissue. And basically, I look at this whole debacle with your baby's lost what now I know is to be a normal amount of weight that led to just a horrific recovery for me that took way longer than it needed to, and was really the root of a lot of why I ended up becoming a doula was because I wanted to make sure that people didn't have such a rough transition into parenthood.
Yes. And if your pediatrician had connected you with a home visiting lactation consultant who could bring a fancy scale to your house, who could do weighted feeds at your house to help reassure you about milk transfer and do those feeds so that you did not have to be running around in LA traffic. You could be in your PJs at your own home and be resting while still getting the reassurances about the weight.
Yeah.
This is a big barrier to feeding human milk to our babies. There are people available to help, people who can provide the right supports, but often pediatricians are not referring to lactation consultants. So if you are someone who supports parents in the perinatal period, what can you do to bridge this gap? Can you start by sending notes from your visits with patients to the care provider after every visit? This will help the provider to know that you're there and that you provide quality service to your patients or clients. Can you show up at doctor's offices with the latest Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine mastitis protocol so that they have it on hand, and introduce yourself and bring flowers for the office? What can you do in your area to reduce the adversarial relationship between pediatricians and lactation care providers so that more people receive the care they need? If you received fantastic care from an IBCLC, I hope you will provide the information of that person to your pediatrician, or OBGYN. Offer to bring their card to the office for them. This can go a long way in bridging the gap and reducing one barrier. So that really lasted for how long do you think that impacted you?
I started feeling more back to myself and just getting my footing as a mother towards the end of his first year or so. But the impacts of like how I felt during that pregnancy and during that birth and during that postpartum lasted a long time beyond that, like to a point where we'd always wanted to have two kids, and I questioned that for a couple of years after having him.
Not sure that you could do it again.
Yeah, exactly. And so my kids are actually 4.5 years apart, and there's a lot to that. It's also that we moved in between from Los Angeles out here to the Boston area. But I didn't really feel ready to even consider that again until my son was 3. And even then it was like, and I'm going into the second one with a lot more knowledge. Like and very different plans for how things are going to go.
Had you already trained as a doula by the time?
No,
Okay.
looking back, I was unofficially doing that. I got really into, that's when I started really getting into podcasts, was around that time too. And the Birth Hour, which is a fantastic podcast of just birth stories, I was obsessed with. And I also learned about evidence-based birth and things like that. And any of my friends that were having babies, as soon as they told me, I was giving them recommendations, just trying to give them all the tips that I didn't have, of try to take an extensive out of hospital birth class maybe. And like when you get home and you're feeling super stressed and you're overwhelmed, I'm here for you, and I'm going to send you food, and make sure you've planned to like have time to rest and things like that. And it was like I'd already been taking steps down that path. And so eventually during the pandemic, I just took a doula training, and that's where I got started.
Amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was after you had your second child.
Yes. Yeah. I had her in 2019, and that birth experience, it was a lot better. And I mostly chalk that up to just how much I educated myself between those births and how much support I baked in for myself around postpartum. I really wanted to have a better experience. I was at a smaller local hospital that is really close to my house. It was only about less than 10 minutes away. That was on purpose. I didn't go to one of the bigger teaching hospitals in Boston because I had been at a bigger teaching hospital with my first, and I didn't like the experience of feeling like I just was part of a giant hospital system that was just shuffling me through. I wanted a quieter, more personalized experience. And I ended up going into labor, like I said, at 39 weeks and 2 days, after again successfully basically saying I'm not going to be induced at least until my due date. And I had a pretty quick labor, which is common for second babies. And I stayed home as long as possible, knowing that I was less than 10 minutes from the hospital. I probably pushed it a little too far because I ended up getting to the hospital and I was fully dilated. And
wow.
Yeah. And I waited a little bit to push because I wasn't feeling an urge to push. And that was important to me because I never felt that urge the first time around with an epidural. And I really wanted to avoid pushing for a long time. Funny enough, I rarely encounter this. So it might be just an oddity about me. I don't know. But I never did feel an urge to push with her. So after waiting for a while and going through, very intense contractions, I eventually just was like, I'm just going to try pushing and see what happens. And then she came out in 3 pushes. So yeah, I might just be an odd person when it comes to not feeling that pressure, because I definitely see the majority of people do. But it was just such a like healing, amazing birth experience. And it was such a more smooth postpartum experience this time around. The lactation consultants at this hospital were actually lovely. I got a little bit more attention. I again pushed to leave at about 24 hours post because I was feeling good. She was nursing. There was no concerns about her or me. And I just didn't want to deal with not getting enough rest at the hospital. So we came home and we had my mother-in-law and my mom both staying with us. And they actually alternated. We were lucky enough that they were both able to stay. They would take turns basically for the first 6 months of my daughter's life. And that was partially because I had to go back to work at about 3 months postpartum and we wanted to keep her home longer. But part of that was also with that idea of in this postpartum time, I want to just be focused on healing, nursing, and bonding with my baby and not being up doing all the things. And I had an older kid, so I needed more support around that. And it was a night and day difference having that support. It's just being able to focus on healing and relaxing.
If only every parent who gave birth and was navigating the postpartum period could be so fortunate. Humans used to care for babies in larger social groups, and now it is rare to hear a story such as this. And this makes feeding our babies human milk that much more difficult. If you know you won't have this level of support once you have your baby, how can you set yourself up to have just a bit more support than you are set up for now? Can you Google a local support group? Can you have a friend who is breastfed on speed dial? Do you need to book an appointment with me now in the prenatal period to discuss your milk making goals and steps you can take to get there? Then you will go into your birth that much more confident and you'll have the tools you need to be successful. And you will know who to call if things start to feel stressful. I would love to be a part of your postpartum support team. As always, you can find my information linked in the show notes or at www.quavinbirthservices.com.
I did have some less stressful, but still stressful moments with feeding her. She also latched just fine, never had any issues with any nipple damage or anything going on, but she was struggling to deal with the flow of my milk. So she would, especially once my full milk came in, I would be nursing her and all of a sudden I could feel my letdown. And as I was feeling that letdown, she would pull back and just sputter and cough and be totally overwhelmed and then start crying and not want to latch back on. And this went on for probably a few days before I was like, yes, she's gaining fine. And yes, this doesn't seem to be like a really concerning issue, but this is weird. Like, why is she so upset about my milk letdown? And why can't she stay on? And then I would notice also that I would have the spraying milk on her face as she was coming off. And so I reached out to my aunt again this time, and she was like, you might have a forceful milk letdown going on. She's like, that's more common with second and subsequent babies. I had nursed my son for a year and a half, and so I think she also was, we know you have a good established milk supply. Maybe you're also going to end up dealing with oversupply this time. We don't know yet because you're still like, your supply is regulating. And she gave me some tips to deal with the forceful milk letdown. But yeah, it was funny to be like, everything seems to be going so smoothly, and then have this little hiccup that was not as stressful, but definitely frustrating and its own challenge that I had to learn to deal with for a little bit there.
So around what day or week did you start to notice that?
I don't remember exactly. I want to say it was not long after my milk came in, though. It was pretty early. Yeah.
Okay, that can be challenging because if it's pretty early on, you don't want to downregulate too fast because you can overcompensate and then struggle with low supply later on. But also, if you have a baby that's really strongly reacting to that overactive letdown, then your baby's really uncomfortable. And so then it's hard to find the right balance between helping your baby to cope and also not jumping the gun too soon. What were the strategies that you used to cope?
Yeah. So one was just changing the position that I was nursing in. So I was doing the classic like cradle hold, and my aunt recommended doing that like laid back
Mm-hmm.
positioning where it's like you're basically either laying down or at least laying back, and then the baby is on you tummy to tummy to slow down the milk flow. That helped a little bit. I also just because I could feel my milk let down, she was like, you can pull her off intentionally when that's happening for a minute and kind of collect the milk, either hold on to it if you want to, or just collect it in a towel. And once the flow slows down, because you'll see it slow down, pop her back on. And so I did a combination of those things. So the other thing that was worrisome about this whole situation is she was only nursing for 5 to 10 minutes at a time, and I was going, is that long enough? That seems like it's a really short amount of time. And but she was, like I said, she was gaining weight fine. She had all of her normal like wet dirty diapers, all that going on. And so what I kind of just over time is just like over time she got used to it. We adapted some of these strategies of trying to slow things down, or at least catching the initial like fire hose level spraying that was
Mm-hmm.
happening, and then she could come back on and nurse fine. Yeah. Yeah.
Did you have an oversupply as well, or was it really just this overactive letdown?
It regulated itself by the time I started pumping.
Mhm.
And so I don't really know if I
Yeah.
had true oversupply in the beginning. And as she grew, she got better able to cope with my forceful letdown too. So it eventually stopped being an issue. I don't think it was ever a serious oversupply issue. I think it was just a forceful letdown, maybe coupled with my body was really ready to produce as
Yeah.
much milk as she needed. And that just by sticking with a feeding on demand schedule instead of trying to implement something where I was trying to regulate it myself, that things were able to work themselves out.
Yeah, and then you went back to work and were pumping. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that might have actually helped to downregulate as well. Anything else with that second baby before?
The rest of her breastfeeding journey was pretty smooth. We nursed for 2 years because I, after the pandemic started, which was like a week after she went to daycare officially.
Oh
Um,
my gosh.
yeah.
That could be its own podcast in and of itself.
Oh, I know. Yeah. Yeah, I was home all the time, and she was home too. And I was fine with kind of nursing as long as both of my kids wanted, but with both of them I got to like the year and a half point and I was like, I'm kind of ready to be done. And with my son it was a pretty easy weaning process because that was back in would have been 2016 when he weaned. And I just left for a weekend. We had already dwindled down to one feed, and I was going away for my friend's birthday weekend trip thing. And we were like, let's just try cold turkey and see how it goes. If he completely melts down, I'll add it back in. But he did fine with it. And so it was a nice clean break with him. With my daughter, I knew she was probably our last kid. And also I was home all the time, like I said, and there was no opportunity to go away for the weekend very easily. People weren't really traveling much. And so we ended up nursing a little bit longer, and it was a much more challenging weaning process because I was always around. But we did eventually get there. It just took a lot of snuggling, and a lot of she was once at least with her, like once she got to that age, she was verbal enough and understood enough that I could say things like milkies are not available anymore. And it was a little bit of a challenge. And I feel like she's such a snuggly kid that she might have kept going if I wanted to. But yeah, for me, weaning both of my kids was like finally the point where I really started to feel more like myself. So it was just I love it when I have friends that keep going as long as they want to, and I'm very supportive of breastfeed for as long as works for you. But for me, it was important when I got into that toddler stage to finally like have my body back a little bit more.
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course.
And yeah, so weaning her was the only other challenge that we faced really.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And how long did it take?
I mean, I started trying around that same month mark, and she finally was weaned by the time she was about 2. So it
Okay.
took a long time. It was a
Yeah.
very gradual process with lots of regressions.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's good for people to hear that it does happen slowly sometimes.
Yeah.
So you, like many birth workers, came to this work out of your own experiences of feeling unsupported and knowing that you didn't want that for other people. Tell me about what you offer people and where people can find you.
Yeah. So my business is called Illuminated Birth, and my website is just illuminatedbirth.com. I am a birth doula primarily, but I do a little bit more of that support into postpartum just because of my own experiences in terms of that's a big focus of my birth prep with clients is also postpartum prep, and then just being available, especially for the first month or so, and making sure that they're well set up. That's my main part of my business is doula support, but I also do birth photography. I started doing that in addition to doula work because I absolutely love birth stories and I get to witness them all the time for my clients. And I love being able to hand them over that documentation of their birth story, and especially that first couple of hours postpartum with their baby. So that's a really fun kind of thing that's just roped into my doula work. And then I've recently started offering childbirth education also. The current format is online. I'm hoping down the road to have some in-person classes, but in this winter of all the viruses hitting everyone, it has stayed online for now. And I really approach it from the perspective of obviously being a science nerd. I have a strong focus on what the evidence says on different topics related to birth, but also I have a strong focus on advocacy and helping you to get the birth that you want out of whatever birth setting you're going to be in, and just really focusing on making sure that you are well prepared and going into your birth and postpartum journey with confidence. Yeah, that's a little bit about
Amazing.
me.
Great. We'll have everything, all the ways that people can reach you, including social media links in the show notes. Thank you so much for sharing your baby feeding stories, and particularly for sharing what your experience was like as somebody with type 1, because I know that can be, as somebody with a physical disability, I know that that can be so challenging to advocate for yourself, and it really can impact what those days, weeks, months, and first years can be like as a parent. And, we prepare as much as we can. And then things like that, you just don't know what you're going to face and how it will throw you off. So I appreciate you being willing to share what that was like for you.
Thank you. Yeah. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come here and talk about it, because when I was going through, especially my first experience, I didn't know anybody that had had type 1 diabetes and been pregnant or gone through breastfeeding.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Whether you are navigating a complex medical situation like type 1 diabetes during breastfeeding, or have supported someone else during such a situation, we only remove systemic barriers through continued advocacy for ourselves and others. If you want to join a community of squeaky wheels who are looking to dismantle barriers to human milk feeding alongside other parents and professionals alike, come join the growing Milk Making Minutes community group on Facebook and make your voice heard. I'll see you there.